So let's get going. You're in the town hall breakout. We will have other folks joining us over the next few minutes. So you can see that, and you should have the chat up. I want to say good morning from Los Angeles. I'm here in the INN headquarters, so to speak, which we haven't been in for 3 months, but we're doing this call from here today. The audience today, we know we have many members in this group, but also many of our members are over meeting in peer groups. And as I looked at those of you coming to this talk, I noticed a lot of emails that said NewCo or startup or stealth mode. So we believe that there are a lot of you who we may not know personally yet, but who might be exploring nonprofit news and starting something. We also know we have news funders, and we know we have community leaders who are perhaps in places where news has been cut back to a ghost of itself or no longer exists in their community and want to see what the options are. So I'm going to talk mostly today to those of you outside of INN, but the members welcome to stay as well. And I hope you will jump in on the chat and share your experiences. I also want to acknowledge our sponsors today, the Knight Foundation and the Inasmuch Foundation, which some of you know as Ethics and Excellence in Journalism, which is now part of the larger Inasmuch Foundation. They're the key sponsors for INN Days, and this is our INN at Home, our virtual version. We also have 4 other sponsors today. Microsoft kicked us off sponsoring an amazing session this morning in Voices of Journalists of Color and what's happening around the country. Facebook, Journalism Project, Patch, and the Trust Project also are our sponsors today. Now, I know that all of you have been living in Zoom, but there are a few quirks when we're dealing with hundreds of people in on Zoom. And with me today, backing me up, your INN staff support is Shireen Azimi, who is our communications director, and she's going to mention a few of the logistics. Shireen?
Thank you, Sue. Yes, so I am the new communications director here, and I wish I were meeting you all in person, but this will have to suffice. In case you missed the earlier technology talk, I will just remind everyone to please mute your microphone. This session is running as a meeting, so if your microphone is on, we will hear you. You're welcome to have video on or off, it's up to you. Just so you know, this is the main room, so if you can stay here at the end, and you will automatically get to the next session. And what you can do is Sue is going to wait until the end to take questions, but you can put questions as they occur to you in the chat. I'll be keeping track, and we should have ample time at the end to get to a good number of your questions. I'll also let you know this session is being recorded, so if something strikes you and you want to remember it, we will be posting the videos online after the conference on our website. So I think that's it, and Sue, take it away.
Thanks. So just to give you a sense, we are going to run through what's happening in media overall, a kind of landscape setting the stage, if you will, for where nonprofit news is now, why it's growing, what impact it's having. We're going to show you what's typical in nonprofit news across the country. We're going to talk about the money, what it takes, what is restoring news in communities, and then focus a little bit on what people can do to found newsrooms or restore them in their communities. And my slides are in advance, so bear with me. Oops. There we go. Sorry about that, folks. There's a timeliness to speaking to you about this today because nonprofit news, this movement was really born out of the last financial crisis. In 2009, about the only nonprofit newsrooms out there were a couple dozen investigative newsrooms, 27 of them specifically, and they gathered in a place called Pocantico, north of New York. They didn't have an outcome in mind. They just feared for the future of journalism. They could see the economic decline coming for it. And they did something really remarkable. These are some of the most competitive journalists in the country, in the world, and they said, in order to save strong journalism, we just need to forget about that. We're setting aside competition. We are going to form a consortium, and we are going to share resources, we are going to share reporting, and we are going to try to save journalism through investigative models and nonprofit models. And they formed INN, but they also, in doing so, I think the most significant thing as we look back is they really changed the course of journalism into this more community-based collaborative type of news. And they did this because they could see the catastrophe that we're unfortunately really now in. This is a slightly dated slide, but those lines unfortunately would keep going down. This is what's happened to newspaper advertising. And so when people wonder, why don't I have local news anymore? This is why. 70% of the advertising dollars in this country are now flowing to just 3 companies: Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So those platforms distribute news. They do support us. They're, Facebook's a sponsor today, but that's only a tiny part. They really, they make money off of news, but they don't invest in original reporting or even mostly checking whether what they post is accurate. And we are now seeing consequences of that, not just in news, but for our democracy. In news, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble advancing this. Here we go. In news, here's what's happening. 2,800 newspapers have closed since 2004. There have been 1 in 4 journalism jobs lost, half of all newspaper jobs. Just since the pandemic hit, the New York Times estimates 36,000 news media jobs have been lost. This is a whole lot bigger than something you sometimes hear. That's a digital transformation. That's just an adjustment from newspapers to a digital world. It's way more than that. What we're really looking at is what's called a market failure. It's when a business stops being a business, people don't make money at it, but the outcome is still incredibly important to all of us in society and the community, and that becomes a public good. You work with public goods all the time: hospitals, your roads, your firefighters. News is becoming a public good, and that communities need to support it because it isn't supported as a business. The other factor going on in news right now that I have to mention at this moment is a global, huge, massive increase in attacks on journalists. Just in the US, since May 26th, in the protests, 279 attacks on journalists have been reported. I want to make a point here. Attacks on journalists aren't really about the journalists. It's not about us individually. It's about us there as the eyes and ears of the community. And I think if you're a journalist, this is a really important discussion to have with your community. Attacks on journalists aren't about the journalists. They're really about preventing anyone from seeing what's going on, from seeing a show of force that's completely inappropriate or seeing the power of a peaceful protest. Attacks on journalists are attacks on the individual rights of every person. And we are seeing that go up, and it's really important in this landscape. So those are the challenges we're seeing. That's why you're seeing journalism decline certainly in the commercial world. What we are talking about here today is not all bad news, though. There is a silver lining in this, and we are seeing that communities do not have to lose their journalism. Across the country, we are really seeing something extraordinary happen. This is in San Antonio from the Rivard Report, a nonprofit that's out reporting in the community, and the community is supporting the Rivard Report, and we're seeing that happen across the country. That these nonprofit newsrooms are growing. They are supported not by advertising, not by the same kind of sometimes overly dramatic news that drives the economies of, say, cable TV and breaking news coverage, but by in-depth coverage of their communities and raising the voices of their communities. We call this news for good, and there's a lot of things about that phrase that make that reflect what's happening. And it's not just a phrase. This kind of news is really different than traditional news. It is much more collaborative than competitive. It is not based on, oh, we're going to serve the community, but we're a profitable business. It is rooted in community and public service. That's the only reason these news organizations exist. And it has at least started on a path toward inclusion and diversity that we have not seen in traditional media. And it's growing. We are seeing news rooms launch at the pace of 1 a month over 12 years. There were 31 just last year, and we are now seeing, as we go into another cycle of crisis, we're seeing another upswing in foundation of new news organizations. 4 out of 5 of these are providing in-depth news, and this issue of community support is huge. I can't overemphasize this. Journalists can't create this world of nonprofit news alone. It's the community that has to step up and support it and informs it. And unless it engages the community and serves the community's needs, it won't get the support to survive. And that's growing each year. So where are the news startups coming from? We really see 3 things. The bulk are new. They are startups. They're just launching. Sometimes started by journalists, often started by business people or civic leaders now increasingly. Not always journalists coming from traditional media either. That's less and less so. There are a handful of commercial media turning nonprofit, and there are public media stations that are building up their news reporting capability. I do want to take a moment and reflect on how diversity and inclusion plays in all this. It is front and center, as we've discussed this morning. Nonprofit news is not free of bias. It's not free of racism. It's not fully inclusive. It is showing a distinct, different momentum, however. Right now, you see newsrooms. We focus mostly on the leadership. We think this is very, very important in changing the world of news. And you're seeing about 13% of nonprofits led by people of color. A similar number, about 28 across the 250 or so nonprofit news organizations, focus on serving communities of color. Those percentages are similar and the numbers are similar, but they aren't identical sets. We think this
Let's bear with Sue. I know she's in her office on a supposedly good connection. Let's just give her a minute to get back up.
So the data that Sue has, while we're waiting for Sue to come back on, can you hear me, Shireen?
Yeah. Let me share that.
The data that Sue is showing you is for nonprofit news. That's the information that we have. So what she's saying is currently 13% of INN member newsrooms are led by journalists of color. Just to clarify Allison's question.
I just shared, today we published the INN index with 2020 data. There will be a second report coming out in the fall with the diversity, equity, and inclusion numbers. This study is going to get into the financials, the revenue of the newsrooms. It's available on our website for free. I encourage you guys to check it out.
Also, for those who are not clear about structure, a 501c3 is not owned by an individual. There's a board that is ultimately responsible for the organization. An individual may have started that organization. An individual applies for the funding, but ownership is not quite the same as you would think in a for-profit scenario. So I just want to make sure that people understand that difference. So a founder, led by a person of color, that founder could have started and is still leading that organization, but the board is ultimately responsible for that organization and is really the decision-making body for a nonprofit. In theory, right?
Is back in.
Can you
Great.
see my screen, Shireen?
I can see it. I don't know if everyone else
Great.
can. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great. So I'm just going to pick off where I left off, and I'm sorry, we are having we have a hardwired screen, but it is hardwired connection, but it is breaking in and out. So if I lose you again, I will just come back in. I want to talk for a few minutes about why it matters, which may seem like I'm preaching to the choir in this audience, but we are in a time when there were so many deep direct needs for food banks, for housing, childcare, you name it. I think it's fair that we're asked, why does news deserve the same kind of funding that might go to other charities? And here's why. It is addressing all of those needs. It is strengthening the fabric of the entire society that's gathering around those needs. And it's giving people the information so that they can act. We are starting to see more and more studies look at what is the actual quantifiable civic impact of news. And you'll see that in these bullets. More people run for local office, more people vote, you save tax money, and people have a greater sense of place where they have news. It also is worth noting, as we're in the middle of a recession, we look at recovery, news is really critical to our whole economy. Freedom of information matters a lot to business, and news keeps everything, as this quote says, really, really greases the economic machine. So it's going to be really important as we go forward. Jay Hamilton, a media economist at Stanford, has often said that he did research that found that every $1 spent on investigative news generates about $100 in public benefit. And the Democracy Fund has looked at this through the lens of local news and found a similar finding. So you see this enormous benefit to communities when they have news, and that is what is turning people's attention to restoring it as well. The structure of what's coming about, as I mentioned, is distinctly different from traditional media. And we use this analogy from Heather Chapin at the New School in New York. Traditional media is much like this oak tree in the center of town. Usually every city or town has one dominant newspaper, one dominant broadcaster. But what is happening now is with these economic changes, these centers of information in town are toppling. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see that many more places. What's coming in their place is distinctly different in terms of format. People always ask, okay, what's the model for news? The model is like these trees. These are aspens. Every tree is individual. These are not cookie cutter. Just like every news site is forming out of its community, it is shaped to what the community needs and what the community will support, and the journalists living in that community. But the thing is underground with aspen trees, they are all connected by a common root system. And this is what we see happening where news is succeeding and rising. It's through these networks like INN, but there's also other networks as well. So I live in the West. The West burns, it's natural. When the mountains burn, all the trees die, but then aspens are the first to come up and restore. And that's what we see in this amazing resilience in nonprofit news. People are sharing resources. They're not operating completely autonomously. And as a result, you are seeing a new model form for news, and it's this networked model. In the 11 years that INN has been tracking nonprofit news organizations, 94% of those that have launched survive. And that's really exceptional. In startups in general, the rule of thumb is 50% go dark within 5 years and fail. In the nonprofit world, the closely equivalent, there's about 18 to 20% of new nonprofits cease operations or go dark within 5 years. In nonprofit news, it's only 6%. They really do grow and thrive, and we're going to look at what's happening around that. Now, you know, we are in an unprecedented time. It's not clear that those survival rates will continue in news. It's not clear, as Tracy Powell said earlier, are they really sustainable? But we actually think this resilience factor will help them spring back up after the pandemic, and that we will see continued growth. So the growth to date, here's where we're at. Here's a picture, a snapshot of nonprofit news across the country. There's about 250 news organizations in INN. We believe there's about 300 out there that are really independent news organizations. There are a lot of nonprofits that start publications, a museum, an activist group, and so forth. And we don't count those. The ones that are their primary mission is news, somewhere between 250 and 300. So that's grown more than tenfold in the last decade. There's now about 3,500 people, including 2,300 journalists, working in nonprofit news. And they share not just directly to the public, but they share through thousands of media partners. So their reach is actually quite broad. When we look at the news produced by this network, we're able to estimate it's above about 150,000 a year. The production has actually gone through the roof since the pandemic started. So I'm pretty confident that would be up around 200,000 the next time we measure it. So I want to take a step back now and stop talking about what they're doing and show you a little bit of what typical work is from nonprofit news across the country right now. And we have some great examples from the pandemic. We're going to start in Madison, Wisconsin. This is Madison 365. About a third of nonprofit news organizations are local, and they're serving a neighborhood or a city. Madison 365's mission is a great one. Excellent journalism to start conversations, find real and lasting solutions, build community, invite action, and encourage emerging leaders. Diverse communities. They really illustrate something we see broadly across nonprofit news, and that is that they don't just cover their communities, they connect their communities. In the case of Madison, here's how this played out. 3 days after George Floyd's killing, the leadership of Madison 365 was able to do what so many across the country have really struggled to do. They were able to pull the community together. In this case, they had police leaders, they had a pastor, they had the director of an urban development center, and Madison 365 CEO Henry Sanders led this conversation on Facebook Live about what was happening and how the community could heal together. Madison 365 in a typical month has about 22,000 followers. This one conversation drew more than 30,000 people, and they were so engaged they posted more than 1,000 comments on this single event. And it illustrates something that is shifting in this new kind of news. This is not your parents' newspaper. This is not a news organization that is putting news out there, writing a story and just leaving it at that. They're finding ways to gather the community and to help them not just read the story, but connect around it and strengthen the community. This is another local outlet and a story I love. It came out of Block Club Chicago. This is a coal-fired power plant. Block Hub is hyper-local. It's covering news neighborhood by neighborhood. So their reporters are out there just talking to people and picking up stuff that nobody else notices. And what they noticed is in the middle of the pandemic, when air quality matters and respiratory safety really matters, the city was about to demolish and blow up this coal plant. And that would have sent clouds of dust through a community, working class community, Latino, very hard hit by COVID already. Block Hub Chicago notified the community, people got active, and the city canceled the demolition of this plant until it's safer to do. We also see the pandemic has really brought out the strength of nonprofit reporting about state government, which is so critical in handling the pandemic and everything that comes after. This is from Spotlight PA, which is a great example. They're a collaborative newsroom, a collaboration between nonprofits and for-profits, and they're really fighting government secrecy in a lot of ways and bringing public health issues to light. In this case, just as contact tracing became, the importance of it was being realized in the pandemic, Spotlight PA realized that the state of Pennsylvania had dismantled its whole system to do contact tracing. The state really, really tried to prevent them from getting this story. They even forbid state employees from talking to Spotlight PA reporter Aneri Patani. But she did get the story. She prevailed. And shortly after Spotlight reported this, the state came up with a new plan for contact tracing. Another significant factor in nonprofit news is that commercial news has been increasingly concentrated on the coast, particularly the East Coast. And the decline of local commercial media is leaving thousands of communities without news coverage. As nonprofit news spreads across the country, we are seeing a really interesting phenomenon in that you'll see local reporting in multiple places, and that is surfacing the scale of a problem. In this case, we're talking about medical debt and how it is handled, particularly for people who are not affluent. This story was done by MLK 50, Justice for Journalism Project in Memphis, in collaboration with ProPublica, one of the biggest news nonprofits. And MLK 50 disclosed that the largest charity hospital in Memphis was being incredibly aggressive in going after poor patients. So after they were treated, this hospital had sued more than 8,000 of them, and adding to this legal burden on top of their health burdens. And as a result of this story, ultimately, the hospital system waived nearly $12 million in medical debt for more than 6,000 people. And we also saw this story, the same issue, come up in coverage in Connecticut. This was the same medical debt that was really got pursued all out of proportion and then was reversed. And in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Watch and WPR disclosed that hospitals were being really aggressive even in the middle of the pandemic and going after medical debt, and we're able to halt that. Frequently now, we are able to see these stories rise in multiple places, and then through INN and our members gather in collaboratives to amplify and escalate the scale of that reporting. And that's one of the big trends we see across the country. National news organizations also remain incredibly important in nonprofit news. They are often fighting government secrecy. They can stick with a story over the long haul, and that was the case here. 2 years ago, Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting, based in the Bay Area, but a national publication, filed a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request, seeking to get records on private companies' employee injuries and illness. And it took them 2 years. There were legal twists and turns, but just this month, a federal judge sided with Reveal and said that injury and illness data in private companies is public and the public deserves to know it. This could not be more timely, but keep in mind it started 2 years ago. While this was working through the courts, Reveal and CIR started working with warehouse workers at Amazon. And they were able to go ahead and publish reports even before the federal government opened this up. They were able to publish reports showing that Amazon's illness rates were sky high compared to industry averages. And of course, with the pandemic, this has become an incredibly timely story. A follow-up in May, Reveal showed that really the dilemma that Amazon workers faced was between going to work and making a living and risking their health or giving up their livelihoods. So it's thanks to this kind of work that any of us, whether we buy things through Amazon, whether we work there, we can now see how companies do in keeping their workers safe. And that clearly is a matter of public interest. So this was just a little spin through some recent stories, but I hope it gives you a good sense of the scope of work out there. We're going to turn now to the question we get most often. What does it take? So what does it take to do news like this? Can we afford it? How much money does it take? Original reporting, which is what all our members do. They do original reporting. They're editorially independent. They're transparent about their funding. That does take money. It takes real money. Even if you go to a 3-hour school board meeting, that's an investment of 3 hours time, prep time going in, writing it going after. So I don't want to downplay the cost of significant journalism, particularly investigative work. It's real, but it's also not as expensive as a lot of people think. For those of you who are civic leaders or thinking about starting a local news publication, I would ask you to think, you probably have a high school in town, and I bet it has a booster club. And the booster club sells hot dogs at the football game, parents donate, the car dealer pays for their name to be on the kids' baseball shirts. A lot of the activities for youth in most towns are paid for by booster clubs. I'd invite you to think of it on the scale of a news booster club. Almost every community can afford a booster club that supports after-school activities. Almost every town can afford to pay for some local news. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes taking you through some new data from the INN Index, which I think Shireen posted the link to. INN Index, we just started benchmarking 3 years ago. We just put out the financial report on where organizations entered this year of crisis, where they were. We will have another report out in the fall about diversity, equity, and inclusion in news from that same index. But to give you a sense overall, here's where nonprofit newsrooms land in terms of revenue. And let me just walk you through this. If you start at the bottom, about a third of news organizations, here's where you're seeing those startups every year. They started under $250,000 a year. And there's that number, that third of our membership that's under that level is kind of self-renewing every year as news organizations start. But now a third of them are up between 250 all the way up to 1 million. And so there's a more robust growth, and you see this, that they grow up. And then we're now seeing 37%, 1 million and up. So there has been a significant growth in this over time, and that gives you an idea of the spread. I'd say 2 things about this. It is always good if a community can start with substantial funding of news, right? Having more money is rarely a bad thing. But I had a conversation lately that was kind of heartbreaking in a metro area, which has virtually no news in its local paper anymore. And they didn't want to start a news organization unless they could get at least 2 million. And they could get a sizable chunk of change, but not that much. And I think that's really unfortunate, because we do see these small organizations starting small and growing. On the flip side, we see a lot of journalists say, I'm just going to bootstrap it. I'm going to pull 20,000 here. I'm going to borrow 30,000 there and bootstrap it. And we encourage you not to do that. It can take as much effort to raise 50,000 as it can to raise 500,000. So in this next slide, we're often asked for this. This is one recipe. It's not the recipe. We are so often asked, often by community foundations, often by civic leaders, okay, we want to fund a news organization. How many people do we hire? What does it cost? What do we need to do? The answers are wildly variable depending on the size of your community. This recipe isn't a recipe for restoring all news in a big metro area. It's kind of what we call the minimally viable. When a journalist calls us, when a community foundation calls us, we say, try to raise two years amount of funding to give the organization a runway. You need a business lead, you need an editor, and then a reporter. Many start with one reporter, or the editor also reports. Some also start with a variety of freelancers. We've seen very successful and very good news organizations start with volunteer reporters from the community and one professional editor. So there's a lot of variance in here, but I hope this gives you some sense of here's the basics. I should point out a lot of news organizations do start with a lot less than this. They do bootstrap and they make it. We just think it's better to talk to your community about the value of news up front and raise funding up front wherever possible. Stepping back from that, I want to just walk through some trends that we see overall in revenues, and so you can kind of see how the industry is shaping. The whole sector of nonprofit news is about 500 million now, $500 million. This reflects significant growth. This number was about 350 2 years ago. So we are seeing, as commercial media declines rapidly, we are seeing really steady, significant growth in nonprofit news media. And that's now starting to happen globally. This is not an overnight thing. You're seeing sustained growth. The funding is also diversifying. Foundations were overwhelmingly the funders of nonprofit news when this started 10 years ago. This year, for the first time, fewer than half of our members said they were dependent on foundations for a majority of their funding. The mix is shifting a lot, so I gave you overall averages, but they aren't really that useful if you are looking at one specific kind of news, because these funding paths are diverging. Local, you're seeing a lot more individuals who are more closely connected to the news organizations come in. State and national, you see a lot of funders really concerned about lack of coverage of civic issues, and they are still providing more robust grant support. But even here, you're seeing individual donations grow, and that's really significant. When it comes to individual donations, this is again back overall. Here we're looking at a pie chart that's just individual giving. Small donors, reader revenue matters, and that is growing steadily. It's about 20% of gifts if you combine membership and small donors. And where you really see gains over time, and we will be doing a lot more to help our members drive this revenue, is donations of over 5,000. Major gifts. They're the mainstay of philanthropic giving in any kind of nonprofit. But because news nonprofits are young, it's not as developed yet in journalism. And so there's potential there. So this is the picture of nonprofit news as it ended 2019. Then the pandemic arrived. So where are we at now? The truth is, there is a great deal of uncertainty about how this plays out, and will the growth that we see in nonprofit news keep going? Can nonprofit newsrooms take a major recession if that continues a long time? We polled our members in May. We didn't mix these numbers with the index because we have good responses from about 90 of our members, but it's not necessarily a representative sample. So think of this as an informal snapshot, and we'll do this again later in the year as well. A couple key things we see from the pandemic. The public is surging to these sites and desperately needs the news, these kind of group convenings that news organizations are leading, as well as basic public information along with timely news reports. 72% of our members have increased coverage, and I would say they have dramatically increased coverage. They've been working incredibly hard to cover that story, and now the civil rights issues as well. 53%, more than half of them, increased their community engagement. Keep in mind, they do a lot of community engagement already, so this is really significant. 60% are having to spend more to raise money. It's getting harder. They're worried about it. Most of our members are looking at this in a 2-year time span, this year and next year, and you see the uncertainty go up, of course, as that time goes up. Right now, most people are okay. You can see 60% expect revenue to hold steady or go up this year. They're okay. 40% are worried they'll see revenue decline. The biggest worry that we have is that many nonprofit news organizations do not have deep reserves. So if they see that 40% that sees a decline, will we lose really good newsrooms that might sustain over time if they don't have a reserve to see them through that? That's our biggest concern right now. We think that's the biggest vulnerability. A small number of organizations that really did beautifully in diversifying their revenue and build earned revenue as well as philanthropy, they have now been hit by downturns in ads and events. So we see that, but that's probably less than 20% of our members. The upside is with audiences come new supporters, and many of our members are reporting they're getting new individual supporters. I want to switch now a little bit to talking to those of you who are funders of journalism, particularly if you're not a news funder per se, right? We hear from communications directors at foundations of all sorts and community foundations and business leaders. And what we often are asked is, we want to support news. We're not sure how to figure out what news organizations to support. So I'm putting a slide up here. This is too dense to read, and I realize I'm throwing a lot of small type at you. So this we'll share after, but it's not that difficult. You can walk through a set of questions, even if you know nothing about news, and sort through, is this news that the community needs? Always start there. Is it what the community needs and it makes a difference? You can also look at ownership, and is this locally owned? Is it locally controlled? Are my decisions made locally? And I'm using locally in place there, but if you cover an issue, that community is local to you. If your issue is water quality, drinking water quality nationwide, that's your community, and the same applies. Are the decisions made within that news organization? Is there a commitment to the community and transparency? Are the books open? So I'm happy to share this, and we're working on a longer form for anyone who's looking at it. But you don't have to have a journalism degree, a deep basis in news to work through this. We also get asked a lot, well, how do I do it? Do I just give them a grant? What will that be seen as a conflict of interest? So I want to talk here. There's really 5 easy ways that civic leaders can support news. And the first one does not involve money at all. It involves your ability to gather the community. We need to have these kind of discussions. We need them more than ever. Particularly in this time of divide. You have the ability to gather your community and have a discussion about news and what it means and what people need to know. And I encourage you to do that, even if you're not sure what else, or if you want to do anything else. Matching funds. Matching funds are very, very powerful because they incent, they put your institutional backing behind individual donations. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Connecting. Collaborations, we talked about it in several of those examples. It's a really important part of nonprofit news. And you can find these collaborative projects or ongoing collaborations between nonprofit news organizations, between nonprofits and for-profits. And those tend to expand the impact of the journalism you're funding. Future-proofing. This is really important. If you give $100 to cover a story, it's going to cover that one story. This is to teach someone to fish. If you give a newsroom general support so it can try to develop these new sources of revenue and create an ongoing, sustaining way to serve your community, you're funding journalism for the long term. So try to future-proof and give general funds that the news organization can use in whatever way it needs right now. These are all experimental. They're all entrepreneurial. They need that wiggle room to find a way to serve the community and sustain themselves. And then fortify. If you think about the aspen trees, this is the closest you'll get to a plug for INN, but it's not just for INN. All these networks, all these organizations supporting individual news outlets are a key part of bringing resources to your community, making sure they can share resources. They're not a separate thing. They're not like an old-time trade association. They are really woven in. And I encourage you to support this ecosystem that is enabling these nonprofit news organizations to serve so many more people. Two things I want to close with here. Newsmatch. You may have heard of Newsmatch. I hope you've heard of Newsmatch. Newsmatch has been out there for 4 years, and it is an incredibly powerful way to help communities support local news. Last year, Newsmatch, national media funders, many local funders, some corporations, they put up a little over $3 million in matching funds. That generated more than $40 million in support of news media across the country. It's really powerful. This is leverage. If you want to dip your toe in to supporting news, if you want to support news in your community, this is a phenomenal way to go. And you can go to newsmatch.org. We will have another campaign starting in November and December. This is an end of year campaign, similar to the Giving Days many of you are familiar with. So I encourage you to check this out. It's a good way to start supporting news. I also want to put an idea out there that we are increasingly having with non-news funders, right? So many foundations will say, well, we don't have a journalism program. We don't support news. But what we are all really realizing is that news isn't something separate. It doesn't matter what your issue is. If you are improving education, if you are addressing the environment, if you're trying to address inequities in health, unless people know about what is going on and what is in your issue, they can't act, they can't get involved. And so you may have heard of 1% for art programs that come up through government funding. We think there is a huge need for a 2 for News. You know, whatever your issue, whatever you're funding, whatever charitable giving you're doing, think about setting aside 2 for News. This could restore news coverage across the country. It doesn't take that much to do it. I think, you know, we come to this at a time, and I'm talking to you now at a time when, you know, you can just look and say, where would we have been without news these last 3 months? How would we have stayed safe? How would we have known where to buy food? How would we get masks? How would we know what our state is doing or failed to do? For many years, I'm speaking here as a consumer, not a news person, but for many years, we have just assumed this kind of news would be here. And what we know now is that it really wouldn't be. Except we have these 3,000 people out there, and they are risking their livelihoods to create these newsrooms, and they're going out to the hospitals, they're going out to the homeless shelters. In many cases now, they're actually risking their lives and their health to cover this news. In the last 3 weeks, I talked about the attacks on journalists. In the last 3 weeks, so we've seen almost 300 journalists hit with rubber bullets, bludgeoned, cursed, attacked in all kinds of ways, because governments didn't want us to see what they were doing or see the power of peaceful protest. And if these are journalists of color, they're taking extra risks to do this, with an extra measure of courage that I think we all need to acknowledge. They're there for their community. They're being there as our eyes and ears. They're being there as witness. They're being there to bring the news home. So these are tough times, but that's news for good. And if you come away with anything, I hope it's this, that you'll share our resolve to make sure we keep that going. And with you, we can keep building that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Okay, everyone, we do have time for some questions. The next session is at 2, so we'll go for about, go for about 7 or 8 minutes and see where we are. So Sue, one question that came up was about sort of the difference in what we mean by ownership and leadership, right? So in a for-profit newsroom, you have an owner. In a nonprofit newsroom, you have a board. Can you address in what ways INN or the field is looking at leadership, who's on the board, who's running the board, who is actually leading the newsrooms?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes to the fundamental differences between a for-profit company and a nonprofit company. For-profit company has an owner. They may be very altruistic or not, but they have an owner and they own that company. A nonprofit is literally owned by the public. It is a public trust, and the board, there isn't an owner per se, but the board is responsible for making sure that any nonprofit serves the public interest and lives up to its mission. So boards are incredibly powerful and important in this world. They don't get as much attention. We know more about the leadership and staffing. And when I was talking about leadership, percentages of leadership and where we're seeing leadership development, I'm talking mostly about the executive staff. And so that may be the executive director or a CEO of a nonprofit. But when you're the CEO of a company, chances are you own the company or you drive a company. When you're the CEO of a nonprofit, you report to the board. So we see a huge need for board development across journalism. We need to take an updated look. We have not done a census of the board's composition across our members in a couple of years. But when I look at them just on a spot basis, many boards are too small. Many boards are very heavy on journalists for understandable reasons. When these things started up, they were seeking funding primarily from journalism foundations. And so having big name journalists and credible journalists on the board was key to how they were gauged. Now we are really seeing this new kind of journalism that's much more engaged with the community. And you really want the whole community that you're serving reflected in the board. So people representing the community and that community trust, people helping with fundraising, people helping with leadership in a diverse mix there. So that's something we do want to take another look at. But for those of you who are setting up news organizations or funding them, you can't overinvest in your board development. It's really, it's the whole basis. It's the whole foundation of all the news you'll be able to cover and what you can build.
So just a quick follow-up. Do you have a suggestion for the sort of minimally sized board?
Yeah, most states have a minimum level, and usually it's 3. I advise you to go bigger than that. You don't want a giant board that becomes meaningless, but if you only have 3 and one of them's the director, which is allowed in some states but not in others, you don't have a team of evangelists. You don't have a good team of critics. So I would encourage startups to, look for a board of 12, look for a board of 10. That really stretches your connections to the community and the smarts that you get to bring in, because look, we're all reinventing journalism, so you need a lot of brains. Nobody has the silver bullet to what this world is going to look like. So get a lot of smart people.
So another question, Sue, when you mentioned the sort of minimally viable newsroom and the requirements, a lot of people chimed in to say that they thought that diversity, equity, inclusion considerations should also be part of that sort of minimally viable newsroom. Also, technology and what kind of technology would you recommend, and also a conception of product. So those 3 things, sort of like, what is the bare minimum that you need to actually produce? Yeah. What do you need to look at in terms of DEI, and what kind of technology do you need to have to get off the ground?
Let me take the first 2 together. That slide in that recipe is not, I was only addressing that through the context of what you need to spend money on initially. So not necessarily the editorial product and so forth. Except at the beginning in there, when I talk about focus on what the community needs, diversity and product are woven into that in a huge way. A lot of journalists will call us and say, well, I covered this beat. I think we need a news organization that covers the beat I covered. And those aren't, sometimes that works, but whether you are a funder or a journalist, you have to start with what the community needs. And that diversity has to be built into that. You know, nothing is going to be news for good if it's not news for everyone's good. And if your organization does not reflect the community you're covering and the diversity of that community, you don't have journalistic quality. It's as simple as that, and you're not meeting the community's needs. So you have to start with what the community needs, whether that's what you covered as a journalist or not. And it has to be rooted in that, and diversity is built into that. I would say that the product is built into that as well. We often, you know, the models that are working are not the same as what you think of as a traditional newspaper. Well, I'm going to do sports, and I'm going to do entertainment, and I'm going to do restaurant reviews, and I'm going to cover city council and the school board and all these things. Generally, when you're starting up, you need to focus on the top needs of the community and then stretch out. That can start with focusing on a subset of the community, maybe a neighborhood instead of the whole city, or it could be one issue. Maybe equitable education is the top issue in your city, and you just focus on that. There may be 5 other issues that are undercovered and desperately need coverage, but you probably are going to need to start with the main one, address that, and move out. So that is the kind of product planning that comes into that, and it's absolutely necessary. Technology, the good news is that the technology has become much more available, much lower cost, and it's not a huge hurdle for people anymore. We have seen very good news sites start just with newsletters and then grow, once they grew a following and were reaching people, grow into websites. We've seen very good ones start even with a Squarespace site and then move into a news site. So the technology is important. The technology I'd say that is most important is a way to capture your readers, what I abbreviated there as a CRM, a customer resource management system. That can be a spreadsheet when you start. It can be Salesforce when you're bigger, and there's all kinds of things in between. But generally, people can now set up their tech for, you know, somewhere. You can do it super cheaply. Many do it between 10 and 20,000, and with annual costs of maybe about 4,000 or 5,000, and they have good responsive sites.
Sue, let me ask another kind of joint question. People were sort of musing about staffing. Again, on the sort of minimally viable slide, you had, I think, about 3 staffers. But then people said, well, what about, collaboratives? How important is it to have collaboratives? People said, what about making sure you have money to pay for freelancers? People said, how about a good stable of volunteers? So do you want to address how you do more with less?
I have to laugh because I put that slide out there and I thought, there's no way to put that slide out without getting hammered with questions, because it's boiling down something that isn't that neat, but we are asked so much. I just want to give people, think of it as a starting point. With the reporting, I was very vague on the reporting because we do see, if you have a rock star reporter, you may build your whole news organization around the following for that reporter. You saw that happen with Montana Free Press in Montana. John Adams is one of the best known reporters in the state of Montana, covering state government. Montana Free Press was built around an entire state following John Adams and wanting to make sure he kept reporting. That happens in places where you have an anchor. You have other places, rural places, where there may not be any reporters who are left in a community or on the ground. And so we see a lot of creativity there. We do see people, East Lansing Information, Eli, with Alice Dreger started that, and that trained volunteers in the community. We see others that may be a mix of freelancers because that's what's available, and they maybe don't have enough money initially to hire full-time staff, or the reporters don't want to work full-time, they're freelancing and doing this. So that the reporting mix, that's the biggest variable. There's umpteen ways to solve for that, and there isn't a recipe. The recipe for that is going to depend on your community, your resources, what you're covering. There's all kinds of ways to solve that. All I'm saying is You need at least one person focused full-time on revenue and business and audience, all the non-editorial. And you need at least one person who is absolutely the editorial leader. They may be an editor and reporter, and then you build what reporting resources fit around that. And I'm sorry, what was the second half of the question, Shireen?
They were also talking about, no, I think you've got it. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what I'd say. Collaborations are really, really important, and we're very excited about them. We're doing a lot more at INN to facilitate them under Jonathan Keeling's program. They are really important, but don't assume, they don't save you resources generally up front. There's this kind of assumption that if you're collaborating, you're combining your resources and it takes less effort. Initially, collaborations tend to take more resources. You have to coordinate. You have to edit, and you're editing across each other, and you have to plan coverage. They take an investment of time. The end result can be a more impact for the coverage or a greater scope of coverage. So we think they're really worth doing, but they do take resources up front. So also, if you're a funder and you want to see collaboration in your city, really be careful. News organizations tend to underestimate at first what it's going to take. So make sure you're adequately funding a collaboration. I think those investments are well worth it because of the added impact, but they do cost more. If I were starting out, would I invest in the collaboration? Again, I think it's going to depend on the individual situation. If there's somebody you know, you have a good relationship with other media, maybe you start with a collaborative. But if you don't have that relationship or you're just starting out, it might not be the first thing you want to tackle.